Well, hello there, fellow geeks and geekettes, and welcome to another video. Today we shall look at the top 5 books written and or illustrated by the great Frank Miller, one of the most influential and, quite honestly, one of the greatest comic book writers and illustrators in the history of the comic book industry. Now, Frank Miller is a tremendously interesting man in that he revolutionized, and he was able to reshape the image of many characters, be it Marvel or DC, for decades to come. And even nowadays, new writers and artists are inspired by Frank Miller. And Frank Miller's books are being sold by thousands and thousands, even nowadays, in collected editions, and the back issues also. So please do keep in mind that this list is my own personal list. Of course, yours might differ. You might add some other books on that list, and also it's not a countdown. I'm not saying this book is better than the other one. I'm just talking about the books as they come up my mind. The first one that I have to mention is, of course, The Dark Knight Returns, which many people consider to be a revolution in Batman comic books, because Frank Miller made Batman into this dark and grim Dark Knight, the caped crusader that we know nowadays. Until then, he was mainly more of a Super Friends character, an Adam Westish character who wasn't so dark and grim. He was wearing blue and grey, and wasn't that far away from smiling from time to time. He was also very well known for having adventures in space and with strange characters, colorful characters. He wasn't as ridden with his depression and trauma from childhood as he is nowadays. Of course, we have to take into consideration the fact that the darker aspect of Batman had been discovered or had been written about before, especially in the ages of Denny O'Neil, when he was writer and editor at DC Comics. So he was really the one who started the Dark Knight, but Frank Miller was the man who really did it properly, who put the cherry on top, and who made Batman into the dark and grim knight that we know nowadays. And because I love The Dark Knight Returns, which is, of course, about an older Batman, a Bruce Wayne who retired and then came back to fight a dystopian Gotham City, I have to mention Batman Year One, which is a must-read for each and every person who wants to start reading comic books, and of course who wants to start reading Batman. When somebody asks me, where should I start if I want to start reading Batman, I always say Batman Year One. And then discover Batman for yourself. Just, find whatever you find appealing. But you have to start with Batman Year One. And maybe a little bit... it's interesting that it's not really about Batman mainly. It's more of a Commissioner Gordon story. It's of course about the first year of Bruce Wayne being Batman in Gotham City, but it is mostly being told through the eyes of Commissioner Gordon, who of course at the time wasn't a commissioner. He was just a police officer who came into Gotham with his wife, who was pregnant at the time. It's very dark, very grim, and it has some of the most iconic depictions and panels of Batman, as well as The Dark Knight Returns. We of course have to mention Daredevil, and as much as Frank Miller revolutionized Batman in DC Comics, he did revolutionize Daredevil in Marvel, or at Marvel. Before Frank Miller got his hands on Daredevil. Daredevil was a Z-list character, maybe a D-E-list character. Not many people liked Daredevil. He was very often at the verge of cancellation, of being cancelled, until Frank Miller got his hands on Daredevil and had 2 consecutive runs on Daredevil. And I have to admit that, wow, man. I mean, if it wasn't for Frank Miller, I would have never liked Daredevil. Especially the one that he created or worked on with John Romita Jr., which is not called Daredevil Year One. It's The Man Without Fear, I believe. Yes, Daredevil, The Man Without Fear. It is basically Daredevil Year One. Frank Miller did the same thing that he did with Batman there. It's about the beginnings of Matt Murdock as Daredevil. Of course, Frank Miller was also the man who created Elektra, the character of Elektra, who is the femme fatale of Matt Murdock, Daredevil. So we could credit Frank Miller with the creation of many great characters. And for those of you who are always complaining that there are not enough strong female characters in comics, well, there are many of them, actually. And as far as the mainstream comic book industry and the big two, the Marvel and DC, Frank Miller created at least 2 of them. The Carrie Kelly Robin in The Dark Knight Returns, which was the first female Robin, I believe. And the second one is Elektra, the femme fatale of Daredevil, the Greek ninja. So yeah, in your faces, people. So that was Batman, Daredevil, and of course we have to mention Sin City. Now, I'm not the biggest fan of crime noir stories, but if I have to pick one, it would be Sin City. Once again, greatly revolutionary. It's black and white. Only here and there Frank Miller threw in a little bit of color, which was then, of course, as well depicted in the movie adaptation of the comic book, on which Frank Miller also worked. I think, if I'm not wrong, he directed it or wrote the script. It was published at Dark Horse. It's not Marvel or DC, but it's very suspenseful. It's filled with action. It's filled with darkness. It's filled with grim and dark noir stories. And I absolutely love the entire series, which of course each and every of these collected volumes, they focus on different characters from the Sin City, my personal favorite being the first one, of course. But if I had to recommend one crime noir book, one more or less independent book, like non-superhero book, it would probably be Sin City, right? And last but not least, Ronin by Frank Miller, which once again, very similarly to Sin City, a revolutionary book where we can see a combination of different influences that, Frank Miller was inspired by. It is about a Ronin that was reincarnated in a near-future New York City. So you can clearly see the inspiration by both Western and Eastern cultures. Now, I have already been talking for more than 8 minutes. All right, I know that I cheated a couple of times with Daredevil, especially. I mentioned his 2 runs. It's not just a single book, but it's really worth it. If you manage to get the entire run by Frank Miller, as far as Daredevil goes, it came out in omnibus editions and in trade paperbacks, as well as the Man Without Fear. It's really, really very much worth it. Sin City, it's also, a series made of a couple of volumes, but still, these are my top 5 stories, really, by Frank Miller. So once again, Batman: The Dark Knight Returns, Batman Year One, his Daredevil, Sin City, and Ronin. If I had to recommend some comic books to somebody, I think that I would be satisfied with these. Like, if somebody asked you what comic books you would recommend to him for a beginner in comic book medium, I think that these 5 comics, just written and or illustrated, because he didn't always illustrate each and every one of them, but in most cases he did. These books represent every single genre that I would really recommend people to to read. So you can use one single author and illustrator to recommend 5 books for a beginner, just Frank Miller. And that's how versatile, that's how creative, that's how talented, that's how awesome Frank Miller is. So I'm glad and happy that Frank Miller is, and that he exists, and that he has worked on comic books for such a long time, because he gave us a lot, and he indeed enriched the comic book industry in general for generations to come. So let me know in the comments down below what your favorite books by Frank Miller are, and yeah, that'll be all. See you soon and bye.